If you had walked through London in the winter just after the Great War ended, and then returned again in the winter of 1940, you would have felt as if time itself had betrayed the city. London had always been loud, clattering carts, shouting porters, steam whistles rising from docks, but in that December it was a different kind of loud. It was the sound of a city breathing through clenched teeth. Bombs echoed like someone hammering on the door of an old house that could no longer afford repairs. And beneath those sounds, almost too quiet to notice unless you listened closely, was something stranger: the dull grinding of a great economic engine running out of fuel. Britain in 1940 still believed itself the steward of a world-spanning empire. Governors issued commands in English to distant territories. British-built railways stitched together continents. Gold flowed into the vaults of London like blood toward a living heart. But the heart was weak now. It had grown old and the arteries were blocked. Yet almost no one knew it, not the citizens hiding in tube stations during air raids, not the newspaper vendors shouting headlines on Westminster Bridge, not even most of the ministers hurrying into government buildings with briefcases full of reports they hadn't yet absorbed. The truth was whispered only in small rooms beneath ground level, rooms that smelled of damp stone and stale tobacco. In one of those rooms sat Winston Churchill, the prime minister who had no choice but to carry a nation's fear on his shoulders. People imagine his wartime speeches as effortless thunder, as if he simply opened his mouth and history fell out. But they never see the moments like this, the quiet hour past midnight when the nation slept, and he stared at a sheet of paper knowing that whatever he wrote to the President of the United States might determine whether Britain lived or died. Churchill was a man of pride, of immense confidence, but that night he felt a different sensation, the realization that an empire that had once financed the world now couldn't finance its own survival. The British treasury, the place that had once seemed bottomless, now looked like a sandpit with the tide coming in. Hitler's war was not a war of infantry charges and cavalry trumpets. It was a war of oil barrels and steel plates, turbines and ball bearings, all things Britain needed to buy, and buy quickly. The nation could build Spitfires, yes, but not fast enough. It could build destroyers, but not enough. And it could certainly not grow oil fields in Yorkshire. Everything Britain needed to fight this new kind of war came from across the oceans, and every crate had to be paid for in cold, unromantic cash. America, at this moment, still slept behind the comfort of its neutrality. It watched Europe burn through the window of history and insisted the flames could not cross the ocean. Congress had written laws that treated the Old World's war like a contagious disease the United States was determined not to catch. Those laws said that if Britain wanted anything from America, rifles, trucks, ammunition, aviation fuel, even the fabric needed for parachutes, it had to pay for them immediately and transport them independently. No credit, no loans, no favors. Just cash. Cash and carry sounded simple enough. But behind that phrase hid a brutal truth. Britain was burning gold to stay alive. Not metaphorical gold, actual bars of it, stacked in vaults that were now being quietly emptied. The gold reserves that had taken centuries to accumulate were disappearing in months. Government officials kept the public calm with reassuring phrases, but they all knew the numbers. They all saw the balance sheets hollowing out. And still, the bills from America grew taller. The nights in London felt colder during these months, but no one knew whether it was the winter air or the uncertainty of the nation's future that chilled them. Factories were at full tilt, but the workers sensed something was unusual. They had lived through hard times before, but never a situation where the enemy wasn't only the one dropping bombs, it was also the arithmetic in ledgers that no one dared discuss openly. Then came the operation that felt like a confession, Operation Fish. If someone had filmed it like a thriller, people later would have dismissed the movie as unrealistic. Under the cover of darkness, crates filled with Britain's remaining fortune were loaded onto warships and passenger liners. Gold bars, bearer bonds, negotiable securities, the distilled wealth of the empire. It was all shipped across a U-boat-infested Atlantic to Canada, not as treasure-seeking safety but as payment, as ransom. Britain was purchasing its own breath 1 month at a time. By the time the gold reached Canada, the Germans had already sunk thousands of tons of British shipping. Every ship on the sea felt like a gamble. And that gamble made Churchill's letter to Roosevelt even more desperate. It wasn't simply a letter asking for equipment, it was a letter admitting that Britain, the great lender of the 19th century, the country that had financed the world's railways and steamship lines, could no longer buy bullets for its soldiers. When Roosevelt received the message, he understood exactly what it meant. The United States was not yet at war, but it was being invited to perform surgery on a nation whose pulse was fading. Roosevelt had sympathy for Britain, but he also had laws restricting him, and a population that had no stomach for another European disaster. He needed a clever way to help Britain without calling it help. He needed a story the American people would swallow. So he looked for a metaphor, one that felt friendly rather than geopolitical. He found it in the image of a neighbor whose house is on fire. If your neighbor's house catches fire, he said, you don't ask him to pay for your garden hose before you lend it to him. Americans nodded. It made sense. It felt humane. But what they didn't see were the negotiations happening out of sight, where the United States Treasury wasn't picturing a neighbor in distress, it was picturing a debtor. Inside government buildings in Washington, officials debated a simple, cold question. If Britain had money anywhere in the world, why should the American taxpayer foot the bill for anything? That question guided everything that came next. Britain, to receive aid, first had to strip itself. Completely. Americans wanted proof that every asset had been deployed and every reserve drained before they would consider bending their own rules. The U.S. Treasury Secretary Henry Morgenthau Jr. became the guardian of this philosophy. He believed Britain should not receive a single crate of ammunition until it had demonstrated, beyond doubt, that it had sold everything left to sell. Not just government assets. Private assets too. Land, factories, investments. If a British citizen owned something valuable abroad, Morgenthau wanted to know about it. British negotiators arrived expecting partnership. Instead, they found themselves under examination. They were asked to detail the full financial anatomy of the empire, every income stream, every asset, every holding, every investment. They tried explaining the obvious, that liquidating long-term investments during wartime was financial suicide, that selling colonial stakeholdings or profitable companies would cripple Britain even if it won the war. But the Americans, calm and unmoved, responded that none of that mattered. This wasn't generosity. It was collateral assessment. The British delegates felt humiliated. They had come as allies. They were being treated as a corporation on the verge of insolvency, one whose owners had lied about their solvency for too long. And in truth, Britain was insolvent. The empire's prestige disguised it, but the books did not. The Americans pressured Britain to sell a profitable giant, the American Viscose Corporation. It was an industrial powerhouse in the United States, a company that printed money. Britain protested, knowing the forced sale would fetch a fraction of its value. But the negotiation was like a vice tightening around their ribs. The message was clear: sell it or the proposed aid evaporates. The sale went through at barely half its worth. Britain received a wound that bled dollars into the U.S. Treasury, while the British taxpayer inherited the debt. And that was only the beginning. The sale of American Viscose rippled through the corridors of Whitehall like a shameful secret everyone already suspected. Officials didn't talk about it loudly, but they didn't have to. Britain had just pawned one of its crown jewels in a hurry, and no metaphor could soften what that meant. It was the kind of thing a wealthy family does only when they finally admit, privately, that their fortune has vanished. It was a turning point, not because the sale itself destroyed the empire, but because it revealed how little leverage the empire still had. Meanwhile, the seas kept swallowing British ships. Merchant vessels carrying food, oil, and munitions were being hunted, silently and efficiently, by German U-boats in the cold Atlantic. Each sinking wasn't just a maritime tragedy, it was another tightening loop around Britain's neck. The island nation depended on imports the way a lung depends on oxygen. Every ship on the ocean carried not just crates, but the continuation of daily life. When Churchill spoke about fighting on beaches and landing grounds, he wasn't exaggerating, but he also knew something the public didn't. Britain couldn't fight on anything at all if the U-boats cut off the ocean routes. That is why Churchill needed destroyers. Old ones, even obsolete ones, steel hulls that could patrol the seas and chase submarines. The United States had 50 such destroyers sitting in naval yards, relics of the First World War. They were out of date, slow by modern standards, barely adequate for frontline use. But to Britain in 1940 they were life preservers. Roosevelt was willing to part with them. But he was not willing to give them away. In exchange for these aging ships, the U.S. demanded something that would have seemed unthinkable only a generation earlier: 99-year leases on key British bases across the Atlantic. Newfoundland, Bermuda, the Bahamas, Trinidad, British Guiana, and more, stepping stones across the hemisphere. Each one a strategic point that the Royal Navy had guarded for decades. Now suddenly those outposts of empire became bargaining chips. When the agreement was signed, diplomats spoke publicly of cooperation, shared security, and unity among free nations. Yet privately, British officials understood the truth. They had just surrendered pieces of their global architecture in exchange for vessels that, in peacetime, wouldn't have fetched a thoughtful glance from a modern navy. It was like pawning the family estate for a set of used tools. Necessary in the moment, ruinous in the long view. Still, Britain accepted the deal. It didn't have the luxury of pride. Pride doesn't sink submarines. But even these sacrifices only delayed the inevitable. Britain's financial reserves were shrinking faster than anyone could refill them. The treasury had been drained of gold. The liquid capital was nearly gone. Investments abroad had been gutted to meet American payment demands. And the war was not shrinking, it was expanding. The Luftwaffe kept pounding cities. Civilians were living on rations. Factories were working without pause. Every day of war deepened the financial trench Britain was falling into. That was the moment when Roosevelt unveiled the idea that would define the war's economic landscape: Lend-Lease. On the surface it sounded generous. The United States would lend or lease war materials to countries whose survival mattered to American security. The language was warm, neighborly, almost pastoral. Americans liked the imagery, a garden hose helping a neighbor extinguish a fire. But beneath that friendly metaphor, the structure of Lend-Lease was anything but simple. Britain would receive supplies, yes. But the terms were constructed with American interests in mind. The American negotiating team understood something fundamental. Britain was cornered, and cornered nations accept terms they would otherwise refuse. Hidden within the fine print, tucked into the bureaucratic wording of the agreement, was a clause that would reshape global trade after the war. Article 7. To most people, Article 7 meant nothing. It was a short paragraph buried deep inside a document few citizens ever saw. But to economists and policymakers, it was dynamite. Article 7 required Britain to dismantle its system of imperial preference after the war, the economic structure that held the empire together. Preferential tariffs, protected markets, guaranteed trade routes, all of it would have to go. This system wasn't merely a convenience. It was the glue that kept British industry competitive. The world had changed since the Victorian era. American factories were larger, faster, more efficient. They produced cars, radios, refrigerators, and machinery at prices Britain could never match. The imperial trading network shielded Britain from that brutal competition by giving it priority within its own empire. Article 7 promised to tear that shield away. British negotiators protested, not with anger but with dread. They knew exactly what would happen if imperial preference fell. The empire as an economic unit would collapse into the open market, where American goods would wash over it like a tidal wave. But Britain had no leverage left. It could not refuse. German bombers weren't waiting for a better trade deal to appear. Every hour of bombardment erased another slice of British economy and morale. In the end, Britain signed. It signed because the alternative was starvation. And so, the war went on with American supplies flowing steadily into British ports. Trucks, aircraft engines, locomotives, canned food, boots, medicine, raw materials, and fuel. These supplies kept Britain alive, but each shipment carried an invisible invoice, not payable then but payable later. Not in cash but in strategic concessions. While British factories focused entirely on the war effort, American factories produced for the war and for the world beyond it. Britain stopped exporting. America expanded exporting. Britain went deeper into debt. America added industrial muscle. And the balance of global economic power quietly shifted across the Atlantic. Then, in late 1944, victory finally began to peek over the horizon. German lines cracked. Allied armies advanced. The war machine that had consumed so much began to slow. Britain dared to imagine a moment of relief. Perhaps, when peace returned, Lend-Lease would taper slowly, giving the British economy time to breathe, to recover, to stitch itself back together. But history is not obligated to honor our hopes. In August of 1945, days after Japan surrendered, President Truman signed an order abruptly terminating Lend-Lease. No warning. No gradual decline. No conversation. Just a switch flipped from on to off. Cargo ships already halfway across the Atlantic were instructed to turn around and return to American ports. Supplies meant for reconstruction, meant for stabilizing life after 6 years of destruction, vanished from Britain's future with a single presidential signature. The shock in London was absolute. Government ministers stared at the announcement as if it were a misprint. Officials ran calculations. Economists looked at import charts and saw only disaster. Britain was importing half its food, nearly all its raw materials, and lacked the foreign currency to pay for any of it. The moment Lend-Lease ended, Britain was financially naked. That was when one of the greatest economists in history, John Maynard Keynes, boarded a ship to the United States. He was older now, pale and weary, fighting illness with the same stubbornness that Britain used to fight the war. But he went anyway because someone had to plead for Britain's economic survival. He arrived with a simple argument. Britain had stood against Hitler for 2 years alone, carrying a burden that protected the United States as much as itself. The war had been a shared victory. The recovery should be shared as well. But in Washington, Keynes found little patience for shared sacrifice. American officials saw Britain not as a heroic ally, but as a debtor returning to the bank with hat in hand. They refused any notion of a gift or grant. They insisted that whatever assistance Britain received would come as a loan, and not a generous one. The loan would be smaller than what Keynes believed necessary. And worse, it came tied with another condition that would later become infamous: sterling convertibility. Britain, within 1 year, would be required to make the pound fully exchangeable for dollars. Anyone holding pounds anywhere in the world would be allowed to demand American currency in return. Keynes understood immediately what this meant. It was a ticking bomb. And Britain was running out of time. Keynes tried to explain it as gently as he could to the Americans, though inside he felt the instinctive panic of a man watching a wall collapse in slow motion. If Britain made the pound freely convertible, then every country holding wartime sterling balances, India, Egypt, South Africa, Australia, and dozens more, would immediately exchange them for dollars, not because they disliked Britain, but because America had become the industrial magnet of the world. Dollars meant American machines, American vehicles, American consumer goods, American investment opportunities. Pounds could buy only what Britain produced, and Britain's war-battered industries couldn't compete. Convertibility, in other words, would trigger a stampede. Britain's reserves would evaporate in days, and the loan, already insufficient, would drain like water in a cracked basin. Keynes saw this future as clearly as if a projector had been pointed at the wall, showing the catastrophe frame by frame. But the Americans insisted. They wanted the global financial system remade, and they wanted it made in their image, under their rules. Britain accepted the loan because it had no other choice. Keynes returned home weakened, his heart failing, his mind exhausted, but still trying to prepare the government for the economic winter ahead. Ministers listened with grim faces. They understood that they were stepping onto a tightrope with no safety net beneath them. The war had ended, but the danger had not. Then came the winter of 1947, a winter so harsh that even old farmers, men who had lived through frosts that froze riverbanks solid, whispered that they'd never seen anything like it. Snowstorms buried rail lines, froze coal piles, and killed livestock. Electricity stations shut down as coal ran out. Factories closed. People walked to work through snowdrifts only to find the factories locked until fuel returned. It was the kind of weather that exposes a nation's vulnerabilities, the kind that makes newspapers print words like crisis and emergency without hesitation. In the midst of this frozen paralysis, the convertibility deadline approached. Britain, following the terms of the 1946 loan, made the pound exchangeable for dollars on July 15, 1947. It was an event economists later compared to opening a dam that had been shaking under pressure for years. The rush was instant. Countries holding vast sterling balances, especially in Asia, the Middle East, and the Commonwealth, began converting pounds into dollars at a pace so rapid that Treasury officials in London watched the numbers like doctors monitoring a critical patient whose heartbeat was collapsing. Each morning's report was worse than the last. The reserves melted away with terrifying speed like frost on a stove. What was supposed to be a post-war reconstruction fund became a funnel transferring wealth out of Britain and into the global dollar system. Keynes had predicted this outcome, but even he might not have imagined the speed. In only a few weeks, Britain had lost hundreds of millions of dollars. The reserves dropped to emergency levels. The government panicked. And then, with barely 5 weeks of convertibility behind them, Britain did the only thing it could do. It slammed the door shut. Convertibility was suspended. The experiment, demanded by America, resisted by Britain, feared by economists, had lasted just over a month. But the damage lingered far longer. British finances were shredded. Confidence sank. Imports became more expensive. Rationing, instead of ending with the war, intensified. For ordinary people, the post-war years felt, in some ways, harsher than the war itself. But the economic fallout did something more than just strain grocery budgets and shutter factories. It marked the moment when Britain's place in the world shifted irreversibly. Before the war, Britain had been the financial anchor of the global economy. After 1947, that role was gone. The pound, once the world's reserve currency, was now a fragile, controlled instrument. The center of global finance had moved to Washington and New York, and it wasn't moving back. This shift became painfully clear just a few months before the convertibility crisis even began. In February 1947, the British government sent a message to Washington that carried the weight of a century. It informed the United States that Britain could no longer provide financial support to Greece or Turkey, two countries facing intense pressure from Soviet-backed movements. For generations, Britain had acted as the protector of Eastern Mediterranean stability. Now, it was too poor to continue. That single telegram changed the course of the 20th century. It triggered what became known as the Truman Doctrine, America stepping into the role Britain had played since the Napoleonic era. Washington would now be the guarantor of Western security. It wasn't merely a policy shift, it was an admission. Britain could no longer afford to police the world. The baton of global leadership had slipped from its hand.
In London, politicians debated how things had come to this point. Some blamed the war. Some blamed the Americans for harsh terms. Others blamed decades of economic complacency. But among the public, blame was less important than reality. Wages were low. Goods were scarce. Queues formed outside shops. Rationing still governed daily life. Children born after the war felt none of the promised post-war prosperity. They knew only thrift, coupons, and shortages. Meanwhile, American factories were flooding the world with goods. Radios, automobiles, appliances, symbols of abundance. The contrast between the two countries couldn't have been sharper. Britain had fought longer, lost more lives proportionally, and sacrificed more economically. Yet America emerged from the war not weakened, but strengthened, enriched by wartime production and untouched by devastation at home. In 1949, Britain's declining financial health forced yet another painful decision: devaluation of the pound. Overnight, the currency dropped from $4.86 to $2.80. It was an admission that Britain's economy could no longer justify its old status. Imports became more expensive, living standards dipped further, and the psychological blow was immense. The country that had once dominated global finance now had to accept a diminished place in the economic hierarchy. These events weren't isolated storms. They were tremors marking the collapse of an old world order. The British Empire had survived wars, revolutions, and global upheavals, but it could not survive the arithmetic of the mid-20th century. Colonial economies demanded more autonomy. New nations were rising in Asia and Africa, questioning why they should tie their futures to a metropole that could barely manage its own crisis. The imperial model, which depended on Britain's economic strength, was eroding as fast as Britain's balance sheets. And yet, even as the empire unraveled, the bills from America did not stop. The Anglo-American loan, finalized in 1946, came with repayment terms stretching decades into the future. Interest accumulated. Payments continued across changing governments, changing economies, changing generations. The war had ended, but the financial obligations had not. Through the 1950s, 60s, 70s, and beyond, the loan sat quietly in the background of British economic planning, a reminder, subtle but ever-present, that survival had a price. It became part of the rhythm of national finances, like a distant metronome that never stopped ticking. People who celebrated VE Day in 1945 did not live to see the final payment. Their grandchildren and great-grandchildren grew up in a world shaped by decisions made before they were born. Britain reinvented itself many times over, from empire to welfare state to modern economy, but the loan endured through it all. It wasn't just money. It was a memory, a scar. Finally, in December 2006, 60 years after the loan was agreed, the final payment was made to the United States Treasury. Newspapers marked the moment, some with pride, others with quiet melancholy. Few people paused to reflect on what the payment truly represented: the closing chapter of a transaction that had begun in crisis and ended long after the world that created it had disappeared. The United States didn't conquer the British Empire with soldiers. It didn't need to. Economics did the work. Contracts did the work. Loans did the work. Piece by piece, asset by asset, market by market, influence by influence, the British Empire was dismantled not on the battlefield, but in boardrooms, negotiations, and the pages of agreements written in neutral bureaucratic language. The British won the war against fascism. But in that victory, they surrendered the economic foundations that had supported their global dominance for centuries. And as Britain shrank economically, the United States expanded into the vacuum. It became the world's supplier, the world's creditor, the world's strategist. The center of gravity shifted westward, and the age of American ascendancy began. But this shift didn't happen overnight. It happened one compromise at a time, one sale at a time, one concession at a time. Britain didn't collapse. It was peeled apart layer by layer until only the core remained. And that core was enough to rebuild a modern nation. But never again an empire. If you look closely at history, not the dates, not the treaties, but the patterns, you begin to see something that often hides behind the drama of battles and speeches. Empires rarely fall with a single blow. They don't shatter like glass. They erode like stone under a long, grinding tide. And if you follow that tide through Britain's 20th century story, you can see exactly how the water carried its empire away, inch by inch, until the shoreline was unrecognizable. What happened after World War II did not feel like a sudden collapse. It felt more like waking from a fever and realizing the world you knew no longer existed. For ordinary Britons, the war had been won, but the victory tasted thin. The streets were full of relief, yes, but also fatigue, emotional fatigue, economic fatigue, the kind of exhaustion that seeps into bones and lingers long after the celebrations end. Factories that had once hummed around the clock now stood silent, awaiting peacetime conversion that could not happen quickly. Whole industries had been cannibalized for war. Merchant ships lay at the bottom of the Atlantic. Colonies that once supplied vast revenues were demanding political reform, independence, or, at the very least, a new relationship that did not resemble the old imperial hierarchy. And hovering above it all was the shadow of the financial burden, the debt to the United States, the conditions attached to it, and the global system evolving in America's favor. To understand the psychological shift happening across Britain, you have to imagine a nation that had grown up with a certainty embedded in its identity, that the sun never set on its empire, that its flag fluttered across the map, that its navy ruled the oceans, and that its currency was the world's anchor. Then imagine waking one morning to find that all of these certainties, long believed to be permanent, had become negotiable. And negotiation is exactly what filled the years that followed. Negotiation with creditors, with allies, with colonies, with markets, with history itself. As Britain reeled from the convertibility crisis of 1947, debates raged within government offices. Some believed the country should focus inward, rebuild industry, and protect what remained of its economic sovereignty. Others argued that the world was changing too quickly, that Britain had no choice but to align itself with the rising American system. Every plan came with a cost. Every cost carved away a little more of what Britain used to be. But the one thing everyone agreed on, even if they didn't say it out loud, was that the age of effortless British dominance had ended. It wasn't just the Treasury that felt the pressure. Diplomats across the globe found themselves navigating a new world with tools designed for an older one. In India, a movement for independence that had been building for decades finally broke the imperial dam. Britain couldn't finance the colonial administration any longer, nor could it justify the moral argument for holding such a vast territory in the post-war climate. In 1947, the same year the pound collapsed under convertibility, India and Pakistan emerged as independent nations. It was a symbolic blow as much as a political one. The empire's jewel had slipped from the crown. And as India went, so eventually went others. Burma,
Ceylon,
the nations of Africa one by one, the Caribbean territories, the Middle East mandates. Some transitions were peaceful, others were turbulent, but in each case, the British departure carried a quiet undertone. We can no longer afford this. Some historians argue that decolonization was inevitable, part of the global movement towards self-determination. Others point to the economic collapse after the war as the real accelerant. But whatever the cause, the timing is undeniable. The empire contracted at the same moment the British economy was staggering under war debts, currency crises, and American conditions. The most striking thing about this era, however, is how deeply contradictory it felt from the inside. Britain had been victorious in the greatest conflict in human history. It had stood against tyranny. It had survived bombings, starvation threats, and relentless pressure. It had helped liberate Europe. And yet, despite all of this, it emerged poorer, weaker, and more constrained than at any point in modern memory. Victory had not restored greatness. It had underlined its fragility. Meanwhile, on the other side of the Atlantic, the United States was undergoing the opposite transformation. American cities glittered with post-war prosperity. Factories that had produced tanks and aircraft now produced cars and washing machines and televisions. Suburbs expanded. Highways were built. The economy surged. And with every British setback, America's relative strength increased. The US dollar became the currency of choice for international trade. American corporations became global powerhouses. US influence seeped into areas where Britain once held sway. Foreign leaders who once traveled to London now traveled to Washington. The global chessboard had been rearranged, not violently, not suddenly, but decisively. But perhaps the most subtle shift happened inside British minds. A nation that had long taken its global role for granted now found itself wrestling with a new question. What is Britain without the empire? It was a question that echoed through classrooms, newspapers, political speeches, even dinner table conversations. The empire had been the backdrop of British identity for centuries. Its wealth, its military prestige, its philosophy of duty and civilization. Without it, the nation felt like an actor stepping onto a stage after the scenery had been removed. But if the public grappled with identity, policymakers grappled with arithmetic. Britain needed foreign currency. It needed industrial modernization. It needed trade access. It needed allies. And the one ally strong enough to help, the United States, helped only according to its own interests. Some officials held resentment toward America's tough terms. Others believed the Americans were simply acting rationally in a world where power had shifted. But nearly all recognized that Britain was no longer able to dictate the terms of its relationships. It was negotiating from a position of need, and need strips away illusions quickly. This dependency deepened when the Korean War erupted in 1950. The conflict created a spike in global demand for raw materials and weaponry, sending prices soaring. British industries, still recovering from wartime strain, struggled to keep pace. Meanwhile, American factories, larger, faster, and better funded, thrived once again. The imbalance widened. Throughout the 1950s, the British government attempted various strategies: nationalization of key industries, welfare expansion, currency controls, international borrowing, austerity budgets. Some measures helped temporarily. Others backfired. But none could restore what had been lost. And the loan payments to the United States continued, year after year. The amounts were not crippling on their own, but they symbolized something deeper. They were a reminder that Britain's post-war world was built on borrowed money, borrowed time, borrowed security. A reminder that the country still lived in the long shadow of decisions made amid desperation. Yet through all of this, something unexpected happened. Britain adapted. Not quickly, not smoothly, not without conflict, but it adapted. The nation reinvented itself as a welfare state, then as a center of culture and art, then as a modern economy with new industries and global reach. It no longer ruled vast territories, but it became a connector of cultures. It no longer commanded the seas, but it influenced science, music, literature, diplomacy, and education. The loss of empire, though painful, did not erase the country's ability to contribute to the world. But the transformation did not hide the truth of what had occurred. The war had not simply weakened the empire. The economic agreements tied to the war, cash and carry, the forced liquidation of assets, the destroyers for bases exchange, Article 7, the Anglo-American loan, and the convertibility crisis had systematically dismantled the economic engine that once powered it. What centuries of military rivals could not achieve, a few years of financial pressure accomplished. Not through conquest, but through contracts. Not through invasion, but through negotiation. Not through force, but through the arithmetic of survival. By the end of the 1950s, the world Britain had once dominated looked entirely different. And by the time the final loan payment left the Treasury in 2006, The world was unrecognizable compared to the one that had existed when Churchill first wrote to Roosevelt. Yet the story didn't end in bitterness. It ended in understanding, an understanding of how nations rise, how they decline, and how they change shape without disappearing. Britain had lost its empire, but not its capacity for reinvention. The United States had gained global leadership, but also global responsibility. And the world moved on. The price Britain paid for victory in World War II was vast, far greater than anyone alive during the celebrations of 1945 could have imagined. But history rarely grants victories without cost. And in Britain's case, the cost came not in the roar of guns, but in the quiet finality of ledgers, agreements, and signatures that reshaped the global order. There is a particular silence that follows great storms. Not the peaceful kind, not the comforting kind, but a silence that feels like a question hanging in the air. After the Second World War, Britain lived inside that kind of silence. The bombs had stopped. The soldiers were coming home. Streets that once trembled beneath air raids now lay still beneath ordinary rain. Yet beneath that stillness lived a tension the public could not fully name. The country felt older. Not just physically, with shattered buildings and damaged ports, but spiritually. Its confidence flickered like a lantern running low on oil. The British people had endured a war with enormous courage, but courage does not rebuild infrastructure. Courage does not replenish gold. Courage does not renegotiate global influence. Nor does courage turn back the clock. And as the 1950s unfolded, Britain had to confront something it had not faced for centuries, a world that moved forward without asking for its permission. The United States, once a colony itself, was now the gravitational center of global economics, politics, and culture. The US dollar had become the bloodstream of international trade. American corporations set trends. American films filled cinemas from Cairo to Calcutta. American diplomacy shaped alliances. And American military power, anchored by the industrial capacity Britain no longer possessed, became the shield behind which much of the West sheltered. Britain still mattered. But it mattered differently now, cautiously, selectively, strategically. The days of commanding the seas and dictating markets were over. The new era allowed no illusions about hierarchy. Inside government ministries, planners worked day and night to stabilize what was left and to carve out a new identity. The challenge was immense. How to transition from a global empire to a compact nation-state without collapsing into irrelevance. And all the while, in the background, the legacy of wartime agreements kept humming. The financial obligations, the structural weakness in trade, the limitations on currency. Each year, Britain made payments toward the Anglo-American loan, a ritual that linked the present to a moment of desperation decades earlier. Economists occasionally debated whether another system might have been possible, one that allowed Britain more room to recover. Some even argued that Roosevelt had intended to help generously, while the Treasury had tightened the terms behind his back. But such debates changed nothing. The agreements had been signed in ink that could not be washed away, and the empire continued to peel away. The Suez Crisis of 1956 was perhaps the clearest demonstration of the New World Order, a moment when Britain believed, for one brief and reckless interval, that it could still act like the empire of old. The Egyptian government had nationalized the Suez Canal, a waterway critical to British shipping routes, and Britain joined France and Israel in a covert plan to seize it back. The military operation was swift, decisive, and tactically successful. But the political consequences were catastrophic. The United States, the very nation whose financial muscle Britain still relied on, opposed the invasion. It threatened economic retaliation, including the sale of U.S. reserves of British currency that would have destroyed the pound instantly. Britain, humiliated and cornered, withdrew. The message was unmistakable. The empire could no longer move without American approval. For many in Britain, Suez marked the symbolic end of imperial power, not because the empire fully ended that moment, but because the illusion of independence in global affairs shattered like glass. A country that once shaped continents now had to ask permission from another power before taking action. That realization cut deeper than any battlefield defeat. After Suez, decolonization accelerated. Ghana gained independence. Malaya followed. Nigeria,
Kenya,
Cyprus, Jamaica,
Trinidad,
Barbados, Mauritius. Dozens of territories unfolded into new nations, many hopeful, many turbulent, all facing the future without the old imperial framework. This global shift was not entirely antagonistic. Many former colonies entered the Commonwealth, maintaining diplomatic and cultural ties with Britain. But they were no longer sources of wealth. They were no longer the economic pillars that had once supported the British commercial system. And without those pillars, Britain had to reinvent its economy from the inside out. But the reinvention process moved slowly, burdened by memories of what had been lost. The coal mines, the steelworks, the shipyards, monuments of the old industrial empire, declined as global competition intensified. American, German, and Japanese industries surged ahead with newer technologies. Britain struggled to modernize at the same pace. Yet beneath these challenges lay a deeper story, one that often gets overshadowed by the nostalgia of imperial loss. Britain was growing into something new, a different kind of power in a different kind of world. It became a nation of ideas, innovation, and culture, a place where literature, film, science, fashion, and music reshaped global taste. From the Beatles to James Bond, from DNA research to groundbreaking architecture, Britain's contributions in the second half of the 20th century were immense, even as its military footprint shrank. But none of this negated the truth that economic power, the decisive force in global politics, had migrated westward. By the 1960s and 70s, the British government found itself facing recurring crises: strikes, inflation, currency shortages, trade deficits. The IMF bailout of 1976 was another moment when Britain had to acknowledge its changed status. The country that once funded the world now needed international assistance. But even this humiliation did not break Britain. The nation endured, adapted, and pushed forward. It rebuilt industries, reformed economic policies, and embraced new technologies. The modern financial sector grew, centered in London, reclaiming a role, though not the same as before, in global markets. Still, the old debts remained, quiet reminders that history cannot be outrun. The annual U.S. loan payment was not large enough to cripple the country, but its symbolic weight was immense. It tethered contemporary Britain to a decision made in a moment of fear, a decision that had saved the nation but at a cost none could fully imagine at the time. People born during the war grew up, had children, watched those children grow, watched governments rise and fall, watched the world change in ways unthinkable in 1945. The Cold War began, peaked, and ended. The Berlin Wall fell. New nations emerged. Technology transformed everything. And the loan payments continued. Through 6 decades of hope and hardship, Britain carried the receipt for its wartime survival. Finally, in late 2006, the last payment crossed the Atlantic. The check was written, the obligation settled, the debt closed. Newspapers announced the end of an era, with headlines that mixed relief and nostalgia. Most citizens barely noticed. The news felt like a footnote from a distant time. But for historians, economists, and anyone who understood the larger arc of 20th century history, it marked a point of closure. A 60-year shadow had finally receded. But what the payment truly symbolized was not just financial closure. It symbolized the transformation of global power. It symbolized the end of a world where Britain stood first among nations and the rise of one where the United States shaped the global order. And more quietly, it symbolized the way great powers decline, not through dramatic collapse, but through subtle rebalancing, through loans, through agreements, through shifting alliances, through markets, through time. Britain had not been conquered. It had not been defeated on the battlefield. It had not suffered political collapse. Instead, its influence had been redistributed. Its empire, once vast, had been converted into a different kind of role, one among equals in a world no longer centered on London. This is the paradox of Britain's 20th century story. It achieved one of the greatest moral victories in human history, standing firm against fascism when much of Europe fell, yet emerged from that victory diminished in worldly terms. It paid the cost of principle with the currency of empire. And in doing so, it revealed a truth deeper than any anthem or slogan. Power is not permanent. Nations rise. Nations fall. And sometimes, nations are broken not by defeat, but by the cost of winning. By the time the 20th century entered its final decades, the British Empire existed mostly as memory and metaphor. Its red patches had drained from the world map. Its fleets no longer circled the oceans like watchful guardians. Its currency was no longer the axis upon which global trade revolved. And yet, Britain itself remained altered, humbled, but still very much alive. To understand how that happened, how a nation could lose so much and still find a way to stand without collapsing, you have to look deeper than geopolitics or economics. You have to look at how societies absorb loss, how they convert crisis into identity, how they reshape themselves after history has insisted upon a reckoning. When the last loan payment to the United States slipped out of the Treasury in 2006, it concluded a financial story that began in desperation and ended with quiet finality. But what remained was the human dimension, the generations who had grown up within the economic framework created by wartime necessity. These generations had inherited a country that was no longer imperial, no longer dominant, but still searching for its place in a world reshaped by the very victory it had sacrificed so much to achieve. Looking back, it's almost strange how invisible the transformation seemed while it was happening. People living through the 1950s, 60s, 70s, and even the 80s didn't often describe their lives as unfolding within the ruins of an empire. They talked about jobs, mortgages, rising prices, industry closures, and new consumer goods. They noticed the decline of shipyards, the closing of coal mines, the movement from manufacturing to services. They felt the effects of global competition but didn't always trace those effects back to the moment when Britain sold its assets, signed Article 7, or agreed to convertibility. History rarely announces the turning points that matter most. They often hide inside decisions buried under paperwork, inside arguments between exhausted negotiators, inside clauses that looked harmless on parchment but carried the force of a hammer. And Britain had been hammered, not by bombs, but by obligations. Yet the country adapted in its own way. It shifted from empire to influence, from ruling to cooperating, from commanding markets to participating in them, from being an economic hegemon to being a cultural one. Its literature, film, humor, and music traveled farther than any imperial fleet ever had. The world listened to British voices in ways the old empire could never have imagined. And while its military footprint shrank, its diplomatic and soft power grew into new forms, forms suited to a world where influence didn't always require territory. But beneath the surface, beneath the reinvention and the adaptation, remained the history of how the transformation began. The invisible architecture of Britain's post-war world was built upon the financial ruins left by World War II. To understand that architecture, you have to return to the agreements that reshaped everything, the cash and carry rules that drained gold, the liquidation of overseas investments that cut the empire's financial roots, the destroyers for bases deal that traded territory for survival, the Lend-Lease program that provided weapons while extracting long-term concessions, Article 7 that dismantled imperial preference, the Anglo-American loan that imposed convertibility, and the convertibility crisis that nearly collapsed the pound. These events did not simply weaken Britain in the moment. They reprogrammed the entire economic system in which Britain lived. They changed the structure of global trade, redirected capital flows, shifted industrial capacity across oceans, and altered the psychological relationship between Britain and its allies. They turned the United States into the world's creditor and Britain into a nation learning, for the first time in centuries, how to navigate vulnerability. British leaders of the post-war decades spoke often about modernizing the economy, but modernization was always haunted by the ghost of what had been lost. Factories that had once been supplied by colonial markets had no such markets anymore. Ships built in Scottish yards no longer carried imperial goods. Financiers in London no longer handled the majority of the world's currency flows. Every attempt to revive the old industrial base ran up against new global realities. The country had to pivot, and so it did. It leaned into science, finance, technology, culture, and education. It built a welfare state that cushioned citizens during crises. It forged alliances rather than dominions. And in doing so, it began to resemble not the empire it once was, but the modern nation it was becoming. But the deeper truth, the quiet truth, was that Britain was still living inside the aftershock of being economically broken during the war. Not broken in the sense of collapse, but broken like a structure whose foundation had cracked. Some beams still held. Some walls stood upright. But the internal stress remained for decades, shaping every decision, every reform, every political argument. Through it all, the relationship with the United States became something complex, part partnership, part dependency, part rivalry, part memory. Britain admired America, leaned on America, negotiated with America, sometimes argued with America, but never escaped the fact that the post-war order had been built with American tools. The special relationship, as politicians like to call it, was warm enough in public speeches, but behind closed doors it carried the economic imprint of the wartime bargains that had left Britain indebted for 6 decades. And yet, even with all the losses, something in Britain endured that the world still recognized. A resilience measured not in territory or currency reserves, but in the ability to survive transformation without losing its core identity. Britain's story after 1945 is not one of destruction. It is one of metamorphosis, painful metamorphosis, costly metamorphosis, but metamorphosis nonetheless. Still, the question lingers. If the United States economically broke the British Empire, what does breaking truly mean? It does not mean ruin. It does not mean annihilation. It means forcing a nation to relinquish structures that could no longer hold. It means compelling a shift in power that was already underway. It means accelerating a transition that history had started writing decades earlier. The empire did not fall the way empires usually do, toppled by invasion or rebellion. Instead, it was unmade by balance sheets, credit terms, trade policies, and the fragile mathematics of wartime survival. Britain did not lose its empire because it was defeated. It lost it because the cost of victory was too high to pay without surrendering the very system that made it an empire in the first place. And as strange as it may sound, that fact gives Britain's story a unique place in history. The nation did not decline out of weakness or misrule. It declined because it chose principle over preservation. It paid the bill for standing alone when standing alone mattered. The empire was not sacrificed because Britain wanted to shrink. It was sacrificed because Britain wanted to win. And when it did, at a price no one fully grasped in the moment. There is a peculiar kind of irony in the British post-war story, an irony so sharp that historians still pause over it as if it were a puzzle, missing its final piece. Britain won the war. That is undeniable. It resisted Hitler when others could not. It endured losses that would have shattered many nations. It held the line long enough for the world to gather its strength. And yet, the victory set in motion a chain of events that left Britain poorer, smaller, and less influential than before the first bomb ever fell on London. How can a nation win and lose at the same time? The answer lies in the difference between the price of survival and the cost of power. Survival can demand anything. Power requires resources. And by the end of the war, Britain had spent everything it possessed, and much that it did not. Even now, decades later, it is difficult to comprehend the enormity of the economic strain Britain endured. War had always been costly, but the Second World War raised the cost to a level industrial civilizations had never faced. Entire cities had to be rebuilt. Continents had to be reconnected. Millions of servicemen had to be reintegrated into the economy. And for Britain, the financial burden carried a unique twist. Its entire imperial system had functioned as a network of economic inflows, and that network had been severed or sold. To understand how Britain navigated this moment, imagine a man who owns a grand estate, hundreds of acres, a house full of history, a lineage of prestige. Then imagine that, during a crisis, he sells the windows to buy food, sells the orchard to buy medicine, sells the roof tiles to pay his debts. When the crisis ends, he still owns the estate. It still looks impressive from a distance, but the structure is fundamentally changed. It is open to the weather now. The legacy remains, but the substance has been thinned, piece by piece. That was Britain after 1945. Its territory still spanned the globe. Its flag still flew over Asia, Africa, and the Caribbean. Its monarch still sat at the head of a vast commonwealth of peoples. But the financial scaffolding that maintained all of this had been stripped away, and there was no money left to rebuild it. Throughout the late 1940s and 1950s, Britain faced a problem that was almost impossible to solve. It had responsibilities shaped by an imperial past, but resources shaped by post-war poverty. It had commitments to colonies that needed investment, reconstruction, and modernization, commitments Britain could no longer meet. It had military bases scattered across the world that required ships, aircraft, and soldiers to defend, all of which cost money the Treasury didn't have. It had a currency that needed to appear strong even as it buckled under global pressure. And it had a public longing for normalcy after years of deprivation. Every decision the government made seemed to demand choosing between unthinkable options. If it invested abroad, it risked collapse at home. If it focused inward, it risked losing influence abroad. If it resisted American conditions, it risked losing American support. If it accepted them, it risked surrendering more control over its future. These choices slowly hollowed the empire. But the collapse wasn't loud. It didn't happen with tanks or uprisings or sudden revolutions. It happened through negotiation, through delayed maintenance, through exhausted budgets. It happened because Britain had fought a war that lasted 6 years, across 3 continents, without the deep financial wells of the United States or the geographical insulation that protected American industry. Meanwhile, the United States watched a different kind of transformation unfold at home. The war had revived American manufacturing, expanded scientific research, and accelerated technological innovation. While British ration books were being reissued, American supermarkets were overflowing. While British factories struggled to retool, American assembly lines shifted effortlessly to peacetime production. While British ports required years of repairs, American infrastructure leapt forward. This contrast shaped the world in ways that felt subtle at first, but became impossible to ignore. Foreign governments began seeking loans in New York instead of London. International conferences listened most closely to the American delegation. Currency traders favored dollars. Developing nations align their policies with Washington not out of sentiment, but out of necessity. The United States didn't need to take power from Britain. Britain handed it over each time it signed an agreement that traded autonomy for survival. But perhaps the most remarkable aspect of Britain's post-war decline was how gracefully the transition unfolded. It wasn't a descent into chaos or extremism. There were no coups, no civil wars, no dramatic internal collapse. Instead, Britain shrank with dignity and then reinvented itself with quiet determination. By the 1960s, the empire had almost completely shed its territorial form. Independence movements, once suppressed or ignored, became inevitable transitions. Some territories asked for freedom, others demanded it, others simply waited for Britain to acknowledge the obvious. Each act of independence reduced the imperial footprint, but also reduced imperial obligations. The empire no longer sustained Britain. Britain had been sustaining the empire, and it could no longer afford to. This reality became impossible to deny after Suez. The crisis was a mirror held up to a nation that still believed, somewhere in its subconscious, that it could act like a superpower. But when the United States intervened, not militarily, but financially, it demonstrated that Britain's power had changed form. Influence now depended on markets, not colonies, on currency stability, not territorial control, on alliances, not dominion. The British government learned the lesson the hard way. The empire was not coming back, not because it had been taken, but because it could no longer be afforded. And yet, despite the shrinking territory and the shrinking economy, something else grew, something intangible but potent. British culture surged onto the world stage with extraordinary force. It wasn't soldiers who carried Britain's influence now. It was actors, musicians, scientists, writers, inventors, and architects. Britain no longer controlled continents, but it touched billions of lives through creativity, ideas, and innovation. But even this cultural renaissance existed alongside a quiet financial hum in the background: the loan payments. The annual reminders that the victory of 1945 had required an invoice stretching all the way to the 21st century. Every time Britain made a payment, it reinforced an unspoken truth: history's debts take longer to pay than its battles. Generations passed. Children learned about Lend-Lease in schoolbooks, not in newspapers. Adults forgot which territories had once belonged to the empire. Politicians rarely discussed the loan unless pressed. And still, the regular payments continued, quietly sustaining the post-war world the United States had built, a world Britain had helped shape but no longer led. By the time the final payment was made, the British public had grown accustomed to a new identity. The United Kingdom was no longer a global ruler, but a global participant. Influential, respected, culturally rich, diplomatically skilled, but no longer standing atop the world economy. And that was acceptable, even comfortable, for many. Nations evolve. Influence changes shape. Power disperses. What endured was not the empire. What endured was the ability of a nation to survive the cost of doing the right thing. And that cost had been immense. Britain had bled financially to defeat Hitler. It had traded assets, territories, privileges, and future advantages. It had signed agreements that reshaped the world economy. It had accepted loans that bound it for generations. It had abandoned the system of imperial preference that once anchored its global commercial empire. It had allowed its currency to be tested, strained, and redefined. It had sacrificed its economic throne so that the world could be freed from tyranny. In the end, Britain won the war. But the United States won the century. Not through conquest, but through capacity. Not through demand, but through opportunity. Not through domination, but through economic gravity. The British Empire was not destroyed, it was spent. It was cashed in, piece by piece, to purchase a victory that saved civilization. And when the receipt was finally paid, 60 years later, Britain remained standing.
Smaller, yes.
Changed, certainly, but standing nonetheless. If you listen closely to the final decades of the British Empire, you can almost hear the echo of an ending long before the official ceremonies, long before the flags were lowered for the last time in far-off capitals. It wasn't the sound of rebellion or defeat. It was quieter than that, the subtle creak of a structure carrying more weight than its foundations could bear. A system built for a different century now lived inside one that no longer made room for it. Britain, in those years after the war, felt like a ship rebuilt while still at sea. Every plank was being replaced: economic policy, foreign strategy, social institutions, but the voyage had to continue regardless of the repairs underway. There was no option to pull into harbor and rebuild in calm waters. The world was changing too quickly, and Britain had to move with it or be left behind. To understand the emotional core of this period, imagine the mindset of a nation raised with the belief that it had a special mission in the world, a civilizing mission, a stabilizing mission, a leadership role granted by history itself. That belief didn't vanish simply because the budget no longer supported battleships or because loans needed to be repaid. The identity remained even as the circumstances collapsed beneath it. This tension defined the decades after the war, a country trying to live up to a memory while learning how to exist without it. The British people were not blind to the changes. They saw it in the ration books that lasted deep into the 1950s. They saw it in the closure of factories that had once been symbols of industrial might. They saw it in newspapers reporting the independence of territories they once assumed would remain British forever. They saw it in a loss of economic prestige when the pound was devalued, and when the United States intervened in British decisions that once required consultation with no one. But they also saw something else: possibility. The world Britain entered after the war was not one in which the empire was ripped away by force. It was a world in which new nations were preparing to take their place. Nations fueled by their own pride, their own histories, their own dreams. And in watching that unfold, Britain discovered that letting go was not the same as disappearing. Influence could survive loss. Identity could outlive empire. Still, the financial reality loomed over everything. For more than 60 years, Britain paid, steadily, dutifully, quietly, not simply because it owed money, but because the loan represented something far greater than dollars. It represented a moment when Britain had mortgaged its empire to save its existence. It represented a partnership with a rising superpower. It represented a reminder that nothing in history, not even victory, comes without a cost, and yet, this cost created a strange dual legacy. On one side was the story often told. The United States economically broke the British Empire. On the other side was the truth beneath it. The empire had already been cracking long before America delivered the final blow. In the early 20th century, even before the war, the empire was strained by two global wars, by debt from the First World War, by rising nationalism in colonies, by industrial competitors scaling faster than Britain could manage. The war accelerated the decline, but the foundation had been weakening for decades. The United States did not design Britain's fall. The Americans simply ensured that the terms of Britain's survival in the 1940s would reshape the entire world's future. And that reshaping was profound. Because when the United States emerged from the war as the economic center of gravity, it built new institutions to reflect its new role. The IMF, the World Bank, the United Nations, NATO, these organizations formed the architecture of the post-war world, and Britain, unable to afford alternatives, became one of the pillars supporting them. The empire was no longer the model. The alliance was. The world had become a cooperative structure rather than a hierarchical one. It is easy to imagine bitterness taking root in Britain during these years, but bitterness rarely dominated the national mood. Something else did: pragmatism. Britain was a country that had survived plagues, civil wars, fires, invasions, depressions, and global conflict. Reinvention was not foreign to it. And so, even as it negotiated its diminished role, it did so with a kind of gritty acceptance. But acceptance does not erase memory. Through the 1970s and 80s, Britain's economy lurched through cycles of crisis and recovery. Inflation soared. Strikes paralyzed industries. Global competitors grew stronger. The country struggled to define what shape it wanted to take in a world where former colonies were now trading partners, where Europe was integrating, where America dominated markets, and where the empire lived only in textbooks. And yet, despite every economic storm, Britain endured. It did not collapse. It did not fracture under the weight of its past. It did not vanish into irrelevance. Instead, it continued to shape the world in ways that didn't require rule, but influence. That influence showed itself in the arts. British authors, filmmakers, musicians, and scientists reached global audiences. Shakespeare, Dickens, Tolkien, Rowling. British storytelling remained unmatched. The Beatles, the Rolling Stones, Queen, music became a new export of cultural power. Scientific breakthroughs fueled innovation worldwide. Diplomats helped shape global agreements. London's financial center grew into one of the world's most important trading hubs, even after the empire's markets had disappeared. This was a new Britain, not an imperial Britain, but a modern one. Still, beneath that modern identity remained a set of unspoken truths. One of those truths was that Britain had paid a unique price for World War II, a price larger, proportionally, than any other victor. Another was that the United States had played its hand with ruthless efficiency, not out of malice, but out of national self-interest. And another, deeper truth was that the fall of the empire was not a tragedy, but an evolution, a shift from hard power to soft power, from dominion to diplomacy, from coercion to culture. Yet, the most profound truth of all might be this: Britain's decline did not diminish its significance. It simply changed the currency of its power. No longer measured in miles of territory, but in ideas. No longer measured in naval fleets, but in institutions. No longer measured in gold bars, but in global influence that cannot be quantified. The story of how the United States economically broke the British Empire is, in the end, not just a story about money. It is a story about transition, how nations evolve, how power migrates, how the world rewrites itself after catastrophe. It is also a story about the price of doing what is right. Because if Britain had refused to fight, if it had negotiated or surrendered or hesitated, the world would have become something far darker. Britain's sacrifice reshaped civilization, and that sacrifice cost the empire itself. And yet, Britain survived the loss. It adapted, transformed, and found a place in the world that did not require an empire to justify its existence. The empire is gone, but the nation is not. Power changed hands, but identity endured. By the time the 21st century began, Britain had lived through enough upheaval to fill several lifetimes. It had known the pride of empire and the humility of dependence. It had watched the world shift beneath its feet as old systems crumbled and new ones emerged. It had moved from being a global arbiter of trade to a participant in someone else's architecture. And yet, strangely, Britain did not seem defeated by this long transformation. It seemed wiser, leaner, more honest about its place in the world. To understand this maturity, imagine a person who once carried the weight of a great family legacy, ancient estates, old money, an illustrious surname. When the fortune faded and the estates were sold, that person might have mourned the loss. But over time, the memory of the legacy takes on a different role. It becomes history rather than identity. It becomes something to reflect upon, not something to live inside. Britain in the late 20th century was living exactly this transition.
It was no longer the empire.
But it was also no longer trying to be. It had become, for the first time in centuries, simply a nation among nations. Not dominant in waiting, not fading under protest, but simply present, contributing, adapting, reimagining itself on new terms. But even as it embraced this new identity, the echoes of the past still lingered in subtle ways. You could see it in ceremonial traditions, in military parades, in the architecture of Parliament, in the reverence for history that still saturated public life. You could see it in the relationships Britain maintained with the Commonwealth, bonds built on shared history rather than hierarchy. And you could see it in the lingering nostalgia that sometimes colored political discourse, a wistful memory of when Britain stood alone and shaped the world with its choices. Yet nostalgia never blinded the country from recognizing the reality that history had imposed on it. Most citizens intuitively understood that the empire was both unsustainable and morally untenable in the modern age. They also understood that America's rise had not been a hostile takeover, but a natural shift driven by productivity, geography, population, and timing. Still, between these broad truths lay a more complicated detail: the fact that the United States had shaped Britain's decline not only through strength, but through financial leverage. That leverage, applied during the darkest years of the war, reverberated through every decade that followed. The cash-and-carry requirements had drained Britain's gold storehouses. Operation Fish had emptied vaults in a desperate gamble to keep the Navy supplied. The forced liquidation of American subsidiaries carved holes in the empire's financial architecture. The destroyers for bases deal had traded strategic positions for survival. Article 7 had dismantled the imperial preference system, the backbone of imperial commerce. The Anglo-American loan had bound Britain to conditions that nearly broke its currency. The convertibility crisis had exposed the fragility of the pound. And the annual loan repayments had served as a quiet reminder that even victory came with a bill attached. Most people never felt these events directly. They felt the symptoms: rationing, shortages, austerity, devaluation, inflation, but they didn't see the long chain of decisions that led to them. They didn't see the negotiations in closed rooms where tired officials argued over terms that would shape economic futures for entire generations. They didn't see the calculations that determined how much of the empire could be maintained and how much had to be surrendered. But history doesn't require people to see its workings for those workings to matter. The consequence of these financial events was profound. Britain lost the economic foundation of its empire before it lost the empire itself. The political collapse of imperial rule in the 1950s and 60s was merely the outward expression of an economic collapse that had already happened in the 1940s. By the time colonies demanded independence, Britain didn't have the capacity to hold them, nor the desire. The war had reshaped moral attitudes as much as economic ones. And behind it all, the United States stood as the reluctant architect of a new world order. Reluctant not because it lacked ambition, but because it had never expected to inherit the role Britain once played. American policymakers of the early 20th century admired British institutions. They had grown up reading British literature, studying British history, imagining Britain as the old, wise partner in a world they were only beginning to enter. It is perhaps the greatest irony of the era that America's ascent required Britain's decline. But decline in this case did not mean disappearance. Britain did not dissolve into irrelevance. In fact, its cultural influence expanded even as its political influence contracted. And the special relationship, though asymmetric, became a stabilizing force in global affairs. Still, the economic imbalance remained. Even by the late 1990s, America's GDP dwarfed Britain's. The dollar dominated global currency exchanges. American technology companies reshaped entire industries. British policymakers often had to adapt rather than originate. It was the legacy of the wartime financial deals, the unspoken remainder of a desperate moment in 1940 when Britain chose between insolvency and chose survival at any cost. But rather than viewing this as defeat, many historians view it as the moment Britain entered the modern world decisively. The empire had been declining for decades. The war forced Britain to confront a truth that might have otherwise dragged on for generations, that the imperial model was obsolete. And once Britain accepted that truth, however painfully, it began the process of building something more sustainable. This process was messy, slow, uneven, but ultimately transformative. Britain became a nation of innovation, a nation of diplomacy, a nation of finance, a nation of culture, a nation that punched far above its weight on the global stage, not through control, but through contribution. But even this encouraging transformation doesn't erase the fact that something significant was lost. The empire had been more than territory. It had been a worldview, a sense of place in the hierarchy of nations, a belief in continuity, a story Britain told itself about itself. When that story ended, Britain had to write a new one. And like most new stories, it began with uncertainty. That uncertainty shaped everything from politics to public mood to the national imagination. It created debates about Europe, debates about identity, debates about global responsibility. It created impulses toward nostalgia in some eras and impulses toward reinvention in others. It sparked cultural movements that looked back fondly at Britain's past and movements that tried to sever ties completely. It also created a distinctive British resilience, a capacity to endure change without fracturing. Many nations, when they lose great power status, undergo radical upheavals, revolutions, coups, authoritarian retrenchment. Britain did not. It absorbed the decline as one absorbs grief, painfully, slowly, but without losing itself. Perhaps this is why the story of how the United States economically broke the British Empire is not a story of villainy or betrayal. It is a story of necessity colliding with reality. Britain needed help. America offered help on terms that favored its own future. Britain accepted. The world changed. And in that change, the empire ended. But Britain continued, battered, transformed, but steady. By the end of the 20th century, children born after the war could hardly imagine a world where Britain ruled continents. They saw Britain as a modern country, not an imperial one. Their world was globalized, interconnected, technologically advanced, and shaped by American leadership. They grew up not with the empire as a guarantee, but as a historical curiosity. And yet, the legacy of that empire still whispered through the decades. Through language, through literature, through diplomatic ties, through tea traditions in places thousands of miles away, through legal systems, through shared stories, through diasporas, through institutions, through memory. The empire had ended, but the world it shaped had not, and neither had the nation that once governed it.